Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast.
Welcome to the third and what is the final part of an airman's story of an abandoned aircraft, of life as a Kriegi or Kriegsgefangener in Stalag 344 in Upper Silesia, and a tale of his long march to the west as the war was drawing to an end. We left the story with Alan as part of a mixed group containing soldiers captured at Dunkirk, some paratroops taken at Arnhem, and 6 Russians. We now rejoin the story at a dramatic, critical moment.
He woke up one morning to lots of shouting, and he'd been used to that. And it turned out that they were rounded up by some frontline German soldiers. They were moving east. They were going in the opposite direction. They were foot soldiers. They were infantry, but they did have a wide range of serious weapons. They were dressed in camouflage smocks, full helmets, machine pistols, and were really quite aggressive. They immediately dragged out the Russians, lined them up against the barn wall, and shot.
And what happened next?
Well, they then turned towards Dad and his little group. Now, because he'd been learning German in the camp, he could actually tell what they were saying. And what they were saying was they were going to shoot them as well. And again, in Dad's own words, he said, well, I wasn't too keen on this, but I managed to convince them that his Royal Air Force wings, along with the Para's wings, were in fact angels' wings, and that they were medical orderlies. Again, he always said whether the Germans believed him or not, or whether they chose to believe him, ultimately they accepted it, and they told them all to basically go away, to avoid Russians at all costs and keep moving west.
So without that language acquisition, that could have had
it could have had a significant, could have had a different ending.
So these are, as we keep saying, these are terrible times, aren't they? Because there's no food, really. Again, as we've already said, they were not in good condition health-wise.
Yes, there were quite a number of people that died. He said, another comment he made, that at one stage, he said, he felt that we were all victims. He said you'd get guards that would be leaning on the rifle or using it as a crutch. There'd be soldiers helping guards along because they got frostbite and couldn't walk. He said we were all victims.
Just to add a little bit more into the mix, I would say the war's continuing, isn't it? And then you start to get some air attacks by Allied forces who see these columns and think they're German soldiers.
It was mainly the Americans, because they were daylight and they could see these huge columns of people leaving, but they weren't low enough to actually identify them. And so often they were bombed or machine gunned, and so it was not an easy place to be.
There's a glimmer of light coming because the winter ends and the columns begin to reach the southern side of Germany. So what happens in this next stage of the story?
Well, Dad was getting towards southern Germany. He was heading towards Munich. The idea of going towards Munich originally was for the Germans to incarcerate all the prisoners that had walked all the way from Poland at a prisoner of war camp called Moosburg, which was just outside Munich. But for various reasons, he ended up in a town called Freising, which was just north of Munich, and it was quite a mix at the time, but they'd walked a long way, and then they ended up in a sort of castle-stroke nunnery that was really run by nuns and some German medics, and so that's where he ended up. And we're talking now about April, so the weather was getting better, and some of the Red Cross rations had caught up with Red Cross parcels had caught up with them as well, so the food improved, they could pull things together, and we are weeks off, yes. And but of course, as you pointed out earlier, the war wasn't really quite over. And again, in his own words, he said the US Air Force kindly bombed them on the 18th of April, 1945. And he always said he didn't see much in the town of Freising as a military nature, but there was a railway station half a mile away from where they were in the nunnery, and most of the town was destroyed, as was most of the nunnery and the hospital annex that contained both German and Allied POW patients. They said they had no electricity for 3 days and very little water. Bomb craters all over the town, A large piece of railway line was found embedded in the main door to their ward, and he said what they thought was a big sack at the top of a tree turned out to be the local priest. They also managed to dig out about 25 nuns from the remains of the destroyed nunnery. The rest were just buried in the rubble.
Weeks off the end of the war, but the horrors continue. By this time, I think your dad is actually the senior combatant rank, isn't he?
Yes, he was certainly not high ranking, but it was just pure luck. He happened to be the senior combatant rank.
But when it comes to surrender, which happens with a German Panzer major, he surrenders to your dad.
Yes, he did. He offered him two things. Not only did he offer him his surrender, but he also offered him a crate or a case of schnapps to any one of Dad's team who would run up a white flag on top of the castle. So Dad did actually take his surrender, and because this Panzer major had given up. He'd run out of tanks, he'd run out of fuel. He didn't want any more of his troops to get killed. So he gave Dad his handgun in a traditional surrender, a very nice Mauser. He gave him his Nazi party badge, which I've still got, his Iron Cross, which I've still got, and a bottle of schnapps, which has been drunk a long, long time ago.
Yeah, and then, so we're now 8 or 9 days before the end of the war, and the American army turned up, commanded by a very famous general.
Yes, 29th of April, the American Third Army rolled up into Freising, and the Jeep was one of the first vehicles into the town, and it stopped by Dad, my father, and he'd never heard of General Patton at that stage, but he thought this guy looked quite important, and he had a white helmet with stars on it, and thought, oh, here we go. So anyway, they did a fair swap. General Patton gave him 200 cigarettes, and he gave them Freising.
We are getting, thankfully, to the point where he may be able to go home. We've heard on the podcast from these two Lancaster veterans were involved in something called Operation Exodus on Lancasters. Just remind us of what that operation was.
Yes, that was really a repatriation of the POWs, or the Kriegies, from mainland Europe back to the UK. And in terms of Dad's experience, he was taken in horses and carts and various other transports up to Munich airport, and loaded into a Lancaster, and landed at RAF Wittering, back home, first time in best part of 3 years.
He was looking forward to this mess.
Yes, it wasn't to be at all. In fact, at the time he was taken straight to the hospital because he was suffering from dysentery and malnutrition. But he did think that himself and one or two of his friends would, one of his comrades, we said we'd go to the officers' mess and see if we could get a drink. But he went there, they wouldn't let him into the officers' mess because he was improperly dressed. I mean, he said, to be fair, he was wearing a British Army battle dress trousers, a dirty blue Australian Air Force roll neck sweater, which had been knitted by his cousin Marge in Australia and sent to him through a Red Cross parcel. He was wearing his RAF battle dress blouse with his RAF wings, a long German Army greatcoat, and a Russian fur hat taken from a dead Russian. On his feet, he had the clogs that he'd been wearing for a number of years, and it burnt into them like poker work. One was called Scharnhorst, the other Gneisenau now, and they say he weighed about 7 stone. So they were refused entry to the officers' mess, and then they went back to the hospital, where a friendly nurse gave them a bottle of beer. He got a beer.
I get a lovely sense of your dad's sense of humour. And I think he said to you, he wanted, when he was bored in Bolton, to get away from that and have a few adventures. But perhaps the adventures weren't quite the ones that he dreamt of.
Yeah.
What's lovely, I think, Roger, is that your dad's account is preserved, isn't it? Just tell us how you've made sure it's preserved.
Well, it is. A few years ago, I was doing some stuff, checking just on some details, and I was approached by somebody from the Bomber Command Archive who had checked out on the date when Dad, I think I put it on Facebook or something like that to say, oh, it's such an anniversary of 10th of September 1942 when Dad was shot down on his way to Dusseldorf. And I got a link to Bomber Command Archive, and a gentleman said, oh, I've checked this out. We've got all the details of this particular operation. Have you got any other information on it? And I said, yes, I have. I've got his story that he's told me, and I've also got his logbooks. So So I decided to donate his logbooks to the archive, and then the story which I'd had from Dad, which I'd transcribed. I said, if you'd like a copy of that, you would. And he said, oh yes, that would be nice. He said, we've got plenty of these, but he said, they all make up the jigsaw. They give you an overall picture. And so there's copies of all these in Lincoln, the Bomber Command Archive. I wanted them to be preserved, not just because it was Dad, but also because I didn't want anybody in years to come to just go through the box of stuff that I've got in the bottom drawer, underneath some of my shirts at home, and think, what's all this stuff? And just throw it away. I thought things like this are worth keeping, not just for a historical background, but sometimes to keep memories alive, which are really often transient.
I hope through the podcast, it's another small way of keeping that story.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.
We are very grateful to Roger for giving up so much of his time to come to our recording studio and to share his dad's inspirational story. As Roger reminded us, it is all too easy for these vivid accounts to disappear. And it's a great privilege for those of us who work on the Oral History Project and podcast at the Avro Heritage Museum to get the chance to make these recordings and to play a part in making sure that these wonderful moments live on. If you found Alan's story fascinating, and who wouldn't, don't forget that if you come to the museum on our public opening days of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and usually bank holiday Mondays, for a very modest £2 per person over and above the normal entry ticket price, you can have a guided tour of our Lancaster cockpit. Once you're inside, everything that you see is 1940s authentic, and you can begin to get a sense of what being a member of a bomber crew like Alan Yates must have been like. The Lancaster cockpit, by the way, is always a visitor favourite amongst our different cockpit tours. So if you want to get the best pick of the 20-minute timed slots throughout the day, then do try and get to the museum reasonably early after the opening at 10 a.m. And there's more, because when you've done your guided tour of the Lancaster cockpit, you've still got the opportunity to take part in a virtual reality experience in the form of a BBC recording from September 1943 of a Lancaster bombing operation on the capital of the Third Reich, Berlin. Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, famously said at the start of the war that if ever one single enemy aircraft ever overflew Berlin, you could call him a Dutchman. You can actually see his quotation on the fuselage of our Lancaster. Try the virtual reality experience and you will understand how he must have had to eat those words many, many times over. And after your 13 minutes of virtual reality, I promise you that you will have a much clearer understanding of what those 18, 19, 20-year-old lads had to go through night after night to take the war to Germany. We look forward to seeing you at the museum, and in the meantime, don't forget to listen out for the next episode of the Avro Heritage Museum podcast. Bye for now.
Make sure you follow us in your podcast app to ensure that you don't miss out on future episodes.